In this set of lectures, we're going to talk about the brainstem, and then we'll talk about the cranial nerves. The brainstem is this transition area between the spinal cord and the cerebral cortex. So, of course, here's our beautiful cortex up here, and out of the plane down here is our spinal cord. And so this large area here is our brainstem. It's continuous with the diencephalon, which is here. And it is the origin or destination, depending on whether you're afferent or efferent information, of all of your cranial nerves. There are 3 regions in the brainstem that I want you to know. Well, there's only 3 to know. First is the medulla oblongata. Once you get to know it better, you'll just call it the medulla for short. There is the pons here. And then up above that is the midbrain. And here they are in one of my favorite little bathtub toys. It's called a rubber brainstem, and I use these a lot when I teach graduate students and medical students. And it's a giant model of the brainstem. It makes everything just a little bit easier to see. So what we have here, again, is our medulla. We have just the tiniest bit of spinal cord attached still. Our pons, and our midbrain. This is the ventral surface of the brainstem, which would be laying down along the base of your brain. And this is the dorsal aspect, and you can see it looks a little different. In this one, we have actually removed the cerebellum, which if it was in situ within an actual brain, would be sitting right on top of here. And again, we have a little bit of spinal cord down here. We have the pons, the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. And in these sections, we actually did some brain dissecting to illuminate these areas a little bit more specifically. So again, we have the medulla here, we have the pons, and we have the midbrain. And on the the dorsal surface, again, we can see the divisions between the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. In the next segment, I'm going to go through the brainstem one piece at a time and talk about the landmarks and the cranial nerves that are associated with each one. So in the next section, we'll talk about the medulla. The medulla oblongata is the most inferior or spinal cord direction of the 3 different pieces of the brainstem. It's continuous with the spinal cord, and it has a couple of surface features that are easily recognizable. Here it is in a cross section of the brain, and here it is on our rubber brainstem model. The most prominent aspect of the medulla are the pyramids, and that's this kind of lump that you can see here. There's a divide down the middle, and then you can see the other side of it here and here. And we talked about the pyramids when we talked about the motor system and how the motor fibers, as they're traveling through the medulla, come down toward that ventral surface and form these pyramids, and you can actually see them from the surface. Another prominent feature is the Olivary nucleus or Olivary eminence that you can see here on the edge. And just to the medial aspect of the olive is the roots of the hypoglossal nerve. And we'll talk about that later when we talk about individual cranial nerves. And here's what these things look like on an actual brain. And you can see them very clearly. Here's that midline kind of sulcus. Here are the pyramids in between it. And I suppose if you really use your imagination, you can see all those motor fibers and coursing right through here. And then here on the side is our olivary eminence. So early neuroanatomists must have been hungry because they named a lot of things in the brain for food. Two other important landmarks that you can see within the medulla, you have to make a cross-section of the medulla to actually see. One of them is the motor decussation, and the other is the sensory decussation. Decussation simply means crossing. So this is where two groups of fibers are going to cross the midline. We talked about the motor decussation when we talked about motor systems. Remember how motor fibers come all the way from that prefrontal cortex, through the internal capsule, down through the crus cerebri, through the base of the medulla as the pyramids, and we've seen those on the outside of the medulla. They're going to cross the midline at the end of the medulla to become the ventral and lateral corticospinal tracts. And that's what's happening in this image. The pyramids are crossing the midline, and once they've crossed, then we're in the spinal cord, and then we are either the lateral or the ventral corticospinal tract. Remember, which goes down and synapses in the ventral horn. The sensory decussation we talked about when we talked about sensory systems in general. And remember that it is the dorsal column system, fine touch and proprioception, that comes in from the DRG on one side, travels all the way up in the dorsal columns, and here is that big, beautiful fasciculus cuneatus, nucleus cuneatus, and here is the nucleus gracilis. And we talked about the fact that these fibers decussate, i.e. they cross the midline, and that's what you can see in all of these crossing fibers here, which we called the arcuate fibers. So these will then continue all the way up the neuraxis into the thalamus via a structure called the medial lemniscus. There are 4 cranial nerves associated with the medulla oblongata. These are 2 ventral views of the medulla, and the 4 cranial nerves are, starting bottom to top, the hypoglossal, whose nerve roots are going to come out along here. Remember on the rubber brainstem? They're right here. 9 and 10 are traveling here, and those are the vagus nerve and the glossopharyngeal nerve. And then our spinal accessory, poor spinal accessory, kind of an outlier when you're talking about cranial nerves. Most of its cell bodies are actually in the upper cervical spinal cord. They come up and through the foramen magnum and join cranial nerves 9 and 10, and then go out through the jugular foramen to distribute to their targets. I'm going to talk a lot more about the spinal accessory nerve when I talk about it all by itself as we go through all of the rest of the cranial nerves. In the next segment, we'll talk more specifically about the pons. In this segment, we're going to talk about the pons. The pons, quite literally, is Latin for bridge. So if you're ever going to Italy and you see the ponte whatever, it's the bridge over the whatever. So pons means bridge, and it is in between the medulla down here, medulla oblongata, and then pons, and then the midbrains above it. You can see it on a cross section here. So the pons has some very specific features, and these include the pontine fibers, which you can actually kind of see on the surface, big bundles of fibers going across the pons. Another prominent feature of the pons is the middle cerebellar peduncle, which you can see right here going into the cerebellum. And the pons forms the floor of the 4th ventricle, as you can see here. Here's our 4th ventricle, with the cerebellum being on the roof and the pons being on the floor. If you take a cross section through the pons, again, you can see the middle cerebellar peduncle and the 4th ventricle. And again, all of these pontine fibers are going all over the place in here. There are 4 cranial nerves also associated with the pons, and these include the trigeminal, which we can't really see on the actual brainstem, but I can point them out over here on the rubber brainstem. The 5th cranial nerve is here. The 6th cranial nerve is here. The 6th cranial nerve is the abducens. The 5th is the trigeminal, and then 7 and 8 are in here, with 8 being this kind of bigger one here because it's got 2 components, and then the smaller 7th cranial nerve. So these 4 cranial nerves, 5, 6, 7, and 8, are associated with the pons. And again, I'll talk more about the details of these individual cranial nerves later in the series of lectures involving the brainstem and cranial nerves. In the next segment, we'll talk all about the midbrain. In this segment, we're going to talk more about the specifics of the midbrain. The midbrain is the most cranial of the 3 parts of the brainstem, and it's continuous with the diencephalon. Now, the diencephalon is all things thalamus. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the central, the cortex and the gray matter deep within the cortex. But for now, what I want you to know is it's the thalamus, and it's right here. It's a bilateral structure, and we talked a little bit about the thalamus when we talked about sensory systems, because that's a place where all of your senses are going to relay before they go up to the cortex. So the midbrain is continuous with the diencephalon, and you can see that here in the dorsal and then here in the ventral aspects. The other things that I want to draw your attention to are, again, the crus cerebri, which, remember, are those motor fibers as they come from the posterior aspect of the posterior internal capsule, and then they go through the pons, and then they become the pyramids in the medulla. And 2 new structures that I haven't really talked to you much about yet, and that is the tectum. And the tectum just means 4, and what you have are 2 superior and 2 inferior colliculi. And the colliculi, there's 2 on each side, and so a total of 4, hence tectum. The superior and inferior colliculi are involved with auditory and visual relays and some of the coordinating of your audio and visual reflexes, which is more complicated than even I have got all of the logistics down on yet, but I'm working on it. So I'm not going to really talk about those in this series of lectures, but I do want you to know that those landmarks are there and that they're prominent and they're easy to see. So in the next section, next slide, you can actually see the tectum here. Here are those 2 superior and 2 inferior colliculi. Colliculus just means little bump. So if you section through the midbrain, you'll see 2 different levels, or 2 different areas that are of note, and these include the level of the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus. Another important landmark that you'll see is, remember we talked about the 4th ventricle, which is on top of the pons and underneath the cerebellum, and we talked about how the lateral ventricles drain into the 3rd ventricle, the 3rd ventricle drains into the 4th, and the passageway between the 3rd and the 4th is the cerebral aqueduct, and that is right here, right in the heart of the midbrain. Again, we can see our crus cerebri right here, our superior and inferior colliculus, and our cerebral aqueduct. There are 2 cranial nerves that are associated with the midbrain, and those are cranial nerves 3, which is here on the midline, and 4. Now, the reason that 4 is all the way out here is because cranial nerve 4 is very strange. It is the only cranial nerve that starts dorsally and then wraps around the other direction. All of the other cranial nerves exit from the ventral aspect of the brainstem. Only the trochlear, and I don't know why, exits from the dorsal aspect and wraps around. So it's a little bit odd, but that's the way it is. If you've been counting, you know that we're only up to 10 cranial nerves, and you probably already know that there are 12. Cranial nerves 1 and 2 don't really attach to the brainstem. So cranial nerve 1, olfactory, is way up in front, and it doesn't make it to the brainstem at all. But you can see cranial nerve 2, and it is right here. So there is your optic nerve. It usually can be seen coming up from underneath the brain from the eyeball, which is out in here. We'll talk more about the optic and the olfactory nerves when we talk about our cranial nerves of special sense. In the next segment, we'll talk a little bit about areas of the brainstem that don't fall into any of these specific cranial nerve categories. So we'll talk a little bit in the next segment about the reticular formation.